I'm Margaret Wilson, and we are once again at the Briggs-McDermott House in Bourne Village. And today we are sporting an exhibit of paper dolls. And it is primarily from one private collection with some contributions from members. And the purpose of this is directly related to preservation because there's a universality about paper dolls. And we are very concerned about keeping preservation in mind when we give these exhibits, and we absolutely know that at some point in the history of the home that there were people here who participated in the art form of paper dolls. There was a presentation involved last week, and it was primarily the evolution of the paper doll, so it involves some history. We developed the history of paper dolls so that the presentation that has been exhibited here is in some kind of timeline. People viewing it would have a better understanding of how the concept developed. We absolutely know that despite the definition of a paper doll being a flat object with accompanying outfits, that it goes well beyond that because of its enduring appeal. And as long as there has been paper, there has been creative people to take it as a medium and do exciting things with it. And that is what is the magic about paper dolls. It's the creativity that turns it into a very appealing pastime and avenue to develop many different aspects: social, political, attire, fashion, and goes on and on. So in terms of the history, the earliest formats are things that we can't possibly have examples of. Recorded would be the Balinese, who first made a puppet out of leather and paper, and they used it in symbolic ceremonies, and little is known about that background, but the dates on that documentation are as early as 500 and 800 AD. And then lots of people, secondly, would be familiar with the Asian custom of having a little dress which was similar to origami, and it was something also used in a symbolic ceremony where they put the little kimono dress on a boat and floated it down the river, and it had some significance to their descendants and their deceased. Though they're not really following the format of what we know as a paper doll, they are definitely in the very beginnings of its development as a concept. The first paper doll that ours would be descendant of is coming mostly from the 1700s, and one of the first was the use of hairstyles, so that a hairdresser would have examples that they could demonstrate to their client. And the first would be of the woman's head, and then you put a different hairdo on it, and that would give their client an idea of how they would look in that hairdo. Kind of comical that we do the same thing today, only in much more complex fashion, but the idea was there. And that would be the very earliest part of the 1700s. Also, having no examples to use as a prop, many of the fashion people would make their own representations of the clothing they made, and they would make a doll and they would use the different examples of the fashion to place on the original image, and they were all handmade and all hand painted. In the late 1700s, you start to see the use of lithography. It was a very primitive form where they used either a wood block or they used a metal base, and the art form was scratched into it, but it allowed them to make runs so that they weren't just one of a kind. But even these are considered quite rare, and but the technique was developed. And then it crosses over into the earliest part of the 1800s. You have your first manufactured paper doll. And that was probably the truest form of paper doll as we know it. And there were 1810 in England, there were two little characters. It was a book called Little Fanny, and in the book there was a story that was a morality story. And little Fanny did things that would teach her lessons, and also were the small outfits that would accompany it, because it would be impossible to get the original books printed at that time. They do exist. They are in places like Winterthur in Delaware, where you would be able to see them in their document departments, but not on loan, nothing that I could procure. So I made a small representation of what little Fanny looked like and what little Henry looked like. And this was the little booklet, and this was the actual size of the booklet, so the paper dolls themselves were quite a bit smaller. They are being reproduced now. I think in the 70s they reproduced them in their accuracy in this form, but these were just to help depict what they looked like at that time. Simultaneously in France we have another ancestor of the paper doll, and it was really what we know as a jumping jack. It was referred to as a pontin. It was jointed. Again, this is a facsimile that I made from a pattern, and they were mostly presented in a stage format, and they were primarily to mock the aristocracy and the nobility. There were no changes of clothes, but it was truly one of the descendants of paper dolls. From the early 1800s, we moved to the 1830s, 1828, 29, and 30. Paper dolls start to catch on in the United States. And one of the very first companies to make such paper dolls was the McLaughlin brothers. And they made some similar to their European cousins, and were very much as we know paper dolls to be. They had they were made with a back and a front and with changeable clothes. I made my own version of what a McLaughlin brothers paper doll would look like. They're traditionally about this size, and they were front and back, and they had all their own clothes. And they were tabless. They had yet to start to do the tabs, because this is still just the earliest part of the 1800s. The interesting part about McLaughlin Brothers is it was ultimately sold to Milton Bradley, which is still in existence today, and they were one of the more significant paper producers that we know well enough through games and other such related material. All of these examples are still considered quite rare in the paper doll arena, and as I mentioned, some of the research is done through Winterthur in Delaware, and they have presently an exhibit going on. I was able to speak with one of the ephemera people who had documented some of the very paper dolls I speak of. And there were at one time several smaller museums in our own vicinity that catered to the earliest representations, but as oftentimes the case, these smaller museums can't survive, and the collections either go to a larger facility such as Winterthur, or they end up in private collections, which is a shame because then they're not accessible to the public. By now, the theme and the concept has really started to click, and in the mid-1800s, a manufacturer of paper and paper dolls specifically by the name of Raphael Tuck comes from London and starts to mass manufacture paper dolls. They no longer now are for adults, or for just the very wealthy, or for business purposes. They are pure entertainment source for particularly young girls. And his use of lithography that merged into chromolithography was really one of his art forms. The colors were very, very dense and brilliant, and even today with our representations that are so sophisticated from the use of the computer and laser and things I'm unable to explain. There's no, or never has been a proper substitute for chromolithography. It's just a very, very beautiful form. He was so popular, or their company was so popular, that they received the royal warrant from the Queen, and he again was able to document most of his things because of this royal warrant. So it's very identifiable when you are looking to hallmark a certain kind of paper doll. What were all marked, and his series and what they represented. So that becomes a nice feature. So we really are into the full swing of paper dolls. Raphael Tuck has made this leap, and others really started to follow suit. The next important significant movement in paper doll history would be how they start to appear in magazine format. The French had a fashion magazine called Godey, and many people do recognize the Godey prints. They're oftentimes appearing in antique shops, and they were hand-colored, but they did have the magazine format of the style of dress from the mid-Victorian period, which was probably the gala format of, as we think of Victorian clothing. And they would also offer outfits that the children could color themselves, and it would look something like this. And not only would it be something that the children would like to color, it would also be for something that the adults would like to color. In the meantime, back in the United States, the war widows of the Civil War were taking these formats, and they were making a living coloring the black and white paper doll and selling them to little children. So that was one of the important developments. Many of our magazines in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and one of the more famous ones was Ladies' Home Journal, and many characters came out of Ladies' Home Journal as paper dolls, and were followed avidly and were very much an incentive for the magazine to be purchased so the next set of paper dolls could be added to the collection. And the one most famous in the Ladies' Home Journal was Letty Lane, and Letty Lane's life was absolutely covered in great detail in this magazine, and is considered highly collectible today. Other magazines that we are familiar with that carried such notions would be Good Housekeeping, Pictorial Review, McCall's, which Betsy McCall was made famous from, and she was published in the magazine, and all her outfits and travels and all the exciting things that Betsy McCall did became a fashion statement and a personality statement. Cupie came from Women's Home Companion, and Polly Pratt from Good Housekeeping, all names that people would recognize. Also, they were published in newspapers. Boston Globe often did things with characters and things that were continued, so it was again incentive for the purchase of the paper, as well as many advertising formats, products that moms would buy that were necessary. Also published little paper dolls, and they were done in series, so it was an incentive for the mothers to keep buying the product. This was true of Clark Thread, Kellogg's, cereals, lots of medications, underwear, anything that they were selling oftentimes was represented in a paper doll. 1930s to the 1950s for us was considered the golden age of paper dolls. It was an easy way to role play. It was an easy way to make children aware of social trends, and it was portable, so it had many aspects about it that just made a lot of sense. One such thing was collectability. So Hallmark, for instance, made an album, and little cards could be bought, and they were added to the whole album, hoping the children would fill the album, and they were thematic. It would be holidays, different fairy tales, all those concepts were brought into play. During World War II times, when metal was not readily available, lots of the children's toys were made from paper, and so they weren't strictly paper dolls, but they were in the format of simple toys that could be cut out and were themes, such as this was a farm. We had things displayed in the house that show circuses and treasure chests, etc., etc. The way I collected them was according to period, and in some cases makers, or how they were marketed, because it's impossible. The dolls themselves, very few. I have mostly costumes. One of the rarest up here is a whole entire set where they had little heads that changed, outfits that changed, and I have the original box. It comes from the same period, the very late 1800s. It was done in Bavaria, and it shows how they developed, in that the outfits did not have tabs yet, and we don't often think of a paper doll as having an interchangeable head. So that was a new artistic format. The most popular would be the 1930s to the 1950s. The concept was well entrenched. There was every manufacturer jumping on the bandwagon, and they were being played with in a very prodigious way. And if they were not a manufactured paper doll, they were a homemade format. And that concept, you could take a magazine or like a Sears and Roebuck, cut out the models and make your own paper dolls. And so it was a creative experience, and that's what makes it magical. So I think that we have covered nicely how it evolved, how many representations we have in the house that show us that timeline, and I hope you have enjoyed this presentation.